Pay attention to the man with the container in the center. His name is Azim. He just poured gasoline on church pews and struck a match with his fellow activists. Then wind suddenly blows through the sealed sanctuary. He freezes completely and collapses.
My name is Azim. I'm 28 years old, and on November 6th, 2021, I tried to burn down St. Michael's Church in Manchester. What happened that night defied everything I believed about God, Jesus, and my own destiny. This is my testimony of how Jesus Christ saved me from myself. I grew up in a devout Muslim household in Birmingham, where faith wasn't just a belief system, but the foundation of our entire existence. My father was an imam at our local mosque, and my mother taught Quran classes to neighborhood children. Our day began at 4:30 a.m. with Fajr prayers, and every moment afterward was structured around serving Allah. I memorized the entire Quran by age 14, could recite verses in perfect Arabic, and genuinely believed I was living the most righteous life possible. But something shifted when I started university at Manchester. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who looked at me differently. Not as Azim, the devoted son, or Azim, the star student, but as Azim, the Muslim. The way some classmates would go quiet when I entered a room, how professors would glance at me whenever terrorism was mentioned in political science classes, the suspicious looks I received at airport security, I started feeling like a stranger in my own country. The breaking point came during my second year when a group of students vandalized our campus prayer room. They spray-painted crosses over our prayer mats and left bacon scattered across the floor. When I reported it to university administration, they treated it like a minor prank. No arrests were made, no public condemnation, just a quiet clean-up and a suggestion that we be more understanding of cultural differences. That night, lying in my dormitory bed, rage consumed me in a way I'd never experienced before. I started attending meetings at a small community centre in Moss Side. The leader, a man in his 40s with piercing eyes and a carefully groomed beard, spoke about how Islam was under attack across the Western world. He showed us videos of bombed mosques in Syria, displaced Palestinian families, and British foreign policy decisions that seemed designed to weaken Muslim nations. His words resonated with the anger already burning inside me. Here was someone who understood that we weren't just facing individual prejudices, but a systematic campaign against our faith. The brother joined our group around the same time I did. He was my age, equally angry, equally convinced that peaceful dialogue had failed our community. His sister had been fired from her job after refusing to remove her hijab, and his younger brother was constantly bullied at school for his Muslim name. We bonded over our shared frustration and began spending hours discussing how we could make a real difference. The leader encouraged these conversations, gradually introducing us to more radical interpretations of jihad and religious duty. Within 6 months, our weekly discussions had evolved into something much more serious. The leader explained that throughout history, every meaningful change required sacrifice and bold action. He pointed to the early Muslim conquests, the Crusades, the colonial resistance movements. Violence, he argued, was simply a tool that could be used for righteous purposes. When Christians had invaded Muslim lands for centuries, when they continued supporting policies that oppressed our brothers and sisters worldwide, didn't we have an obligation to respond? The idea of targeting churches first came up during one of our late-night sessions. The leader suggested that these buildings represented something more than just religious spaces. They were symbols of Christian dominance, monuments to centuries of colonialism and cultural imperialism. Every Sunday, hundreds of people gathered in these places to worship the same God whose followers had launched crusades against Muslims, who had carved up the Ottoman Empire, who continued supporting Israel's occupation of Palestine. I convinced myself that we weren't planning to hurt innocent people. We would choose times when the buildings were empty, making our statement without causing physical harm. But looking back now, I realize how deeply self-deceptive that reasoning was. We were planning to destroy sacred spaces where families worshipped, where children learned about God's love, where countless people found comfort during their darkest moments. Our anger had blinded us to the basic humanity of those we wanted to terrorize. St. Michael's Anglican Church became our target for practical reasons initially. It was located in a quiet neighborhood with limited police patrols, had minimal security systems, and represented exactly the kind of establishment Christianity we opposed. But as we conducted surveillance over several weeks, my hatred for that building became personal. Every Sunday morning, I would park across the street and watch families walking in together, children carrying Bibles, elderly couples supporting each other up the stone steps. Their peaceful happiness felt like a mockery of everything I was suffering. The weeks leading up to November 6th were filled with meticulous planning. We studied the church's layout, timed the security guards' rounds, identified the best entry points and escape routes. I researched which materials would burn fastest, how much gasoline we would need, what time of night would give us the longest head start before anyone discovered the fire. Every detail was planned with the precision of a military operation. During this period, I stopped attending regular prayers with my family. I told myself I was too busy with university work, but the truth was that I couldn't reconcile the vengeful person I was becoming with the peaceful worship my parents expected. My mother noticed the change, asking repeatedly if something was troubling me. I assured her that everything was fine, that I was simply focused on my studies. The lies came easily, which should have been a warning sign about how far I had drifted from the values I claimed to defend. Ask yourself this question: have you ever been so consumed by anger that you couldn't see clearly? That's exactly where I was in those final weeks. Every news story about conflict in the Middle East, every suspicious glance from a stranger, every reminder of my outsider status in British society fed the fire burning inside me. I wasn't thinking about the families who would lose their place of worship, the children who would lose their Sunday school, the elderly members who had been attending services for decades. All I could see was my own pain and the desperate need to make someone else feel what I was feeling. The night before our planned attack, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining the flames consuming those wooden pews, the stained glass windows shattering from the heat, the cross above the altar melting in the inferno. Part of me felt sick about what we were planning to do, but I pushed those feelings down, telling myself they were just weakness. The leader had taught us that holy warriors throughout history had faced similar doubts before taking righteous action. I was drowning in rage, and this gave me a purpose, even if it was destructive. That purpose felt like salvation itself, which makes what happened next even more miraculous. Because the real salvation was waiting for me inside that very church I planned to destroy. The weeks leading up to November 6th were consumed with surveillance and preparation. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I would drive to the neighborhood surrounding St. Michael's Church, parking at different locations to observe the patterns of life around that sacred building. I learned that the security guard made his rounds every 2 hours, starting at 10 p.m., that the last evening service ended by 9:30, and that the residential street behind the church remained completely deserted after midnight. I took photographs of every entrance, noting which doors appeared oldest and most vulnerable. The side door near the parish hall seemed perfect for our purposes. It was hidden from street view by overgrown hedges and showed signs of weathering that suggested the lock might give way easily. During one particularly bold reconnaissance mission, I actually walked the perimeter of the building during daylight hours, pretending to be a tourist interested in the Victorian architecture, while mentally mapping our entry route. The brother proved invaluable during this planning phase. His background in engineering helped us understand the building's structure and identify which areas would burn fastest. We spent hours studying online blueprints of similar church buildings, learning about wooden beam construction and ventilation systems that could accelerate a fire's spread. The leader encouraged this technical approach, reminding us that successful operations required careful preparation rather than emotional impulses. Gathering the necessary supplies required multiple trips to different hardware stores across Greater Manchester. We couldn't risk buying everything from one location, so I purchased 5 gallons of gasoline from a station in Stockport, while the brother bought matches and lighter fluid from a shop in Salford. The leader acquired heavy gloves and dark clothing from various charity shops, ensuring nothing could be traced back to us. Each purchase felt like another step toward a point of no return. I remember the weight of those gasoline containers in my car trunk during the final week. Every time I accelerated or turned a corner, I could hear the liquid sloshing around, reminding me of what we were planning to do. The smell seemed to permeate everything, clinging to my clothes and following me into lectures and family dinners. My younger sister asked why I smelled like petrol, and I claimed I had been helping a friend with car repairs. Our final planning meeting took place on November 5th in the leader's basement flat. He had drawn a detailed map of the church interior based on our observations and online research. We reviewed our individual responsibilities, escape routes, and contingency plans if something went wrong. The leader would serve as lookout, positioned across the street with a clear view of both the church and approaching traffic. The brother would handle the side door entry and ensure our escape path remained clear. My job was to pour the gasoline and light the fire. The gravity of what we were planning hit me during that meeting in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't just theoretical anymore, or abstract discussions about religious warfare. We were going to destroy a building where real people worshipped, where children learned Bible stories, where families celebrated baptisms and mourned at funerals. For a brief moment, I felt nauseated by the thought of those flames consuming generations of memories and faith. But the leader noticed my hesitation immediately. He reminded me of every injustice we had discussed, every reason we had for taking this action. He showed me photographs from his phone of destroyed mosques in Myanmar and Syria, asking how our planned action was any different from what Christians and their allies had done to Muslim communities worldwide. His words rekindled the anger that had been driving me for months, and I pushed my doubts aside once again. The night of November 6th arrived with unusual warmth for early November. I had barely eaten anything all day, my stomach churning with nervous energy and anticipation. During evening prayers with my family, I found myself silently asking Allah for strength to complete our mission. The irony of praying for divine assistance with an act of destruction didn't occur to me at the time. I was completely convinced that we were serving God's justice. We met at 11 p.m. in a deserted car park near the Arndale Centre. The brother arrived first, carrying a small backpack with our tools and supplies. The leader showed up exactly on time, his usual calm demeanour helping to settle my fraying nerves. We reviewed our plan one final time, synchronized our watches, and headed towards St. Michael's in separate vehicles to avoid suspicion. The drive through Manchester's empty streets felt surreal. Every traffic light, every turn brought us closer to a moment that would define the rest of my life, though I had no idea how dramatically things were about to change. I kept repeating verses from the Quran about fighting injustice, trying to maintain my conviction that this was righteous action rather than simple vandalism motivated by hatred. Parking 2 blocks away from the church, I walked through the quiet residential neighborhood carrying my backpack full of destruction. The weight of the gasoline containers made my shoulders ache, but it also felt like carrying the weight of every grievance our community had suffered. Every step was motivated by memories of discrimination, foreign policy decisions, and cultural conflicts that seemed impossible to resolve through peaceful means. The church appeared larger and more imposing in the darkness than it had during my daytime surveillance. Victorian stone construction that had weathered over a century of Manchester's industrial pollution. Stained glass windows that reflected streetlight in jeweled patterns. A bell tower that pointed toward heaven like an accusation against everything I believed about Christian oppression of Muslims worldwide. The brother was already working on the side door when I arrived at our predetermined meeting spot behind the parish hall. The lock proved more stubborn than we had anticipated, requiring nearly 10 minutes of careful manipulation before it finally gave way. The sound of that door creaking open seemed impossibly loud in the midnight silence, and we all froze for several seconds, listening for any indication that our entry had been detected. Stepping across the threshold felt like crossing into enemy territory. The brother held his small flashlight while I shouldered my backpack and followed him into what appeared to be a corridor leading toward the main sanctuary. The smell hit me immediately. Not just the old wood and stone I had expected, but something else. Incense, maybe, or candles, or just the accumulated presence of decades worth of prayers and worship. Standing in that sanctuary for the first time, something felt wrong, but I pushed the feeling down. This was the moment I had been preparing for during months of planning and years of growing anger. I couldn't allow second thoughts to interfere with what needed to be done. The leader was counting on me. The brother was counting on me. And every Muslim who had suffered under Christian oppression was counting on me to send a clear message. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever been so consumed by anger that you couldn't see clearly? Because that's exactly where I was standing in that church sanctuary, surrounded by wooden pews and religious symbols, carrying gasoline and matches, completely convinced that destruction was the only way to achieve justice. I had no idea that I was about to encounter the very God I thought I was fighting against. The sanctuary of St. Michael's Church stretched before me in the dim light, larger and more sacred than I had imagined from my external observations. Rows of dark wooden pews lined either side of a central aisle that led to an ornate altar dominated by a simple wooden cross. Stained glass windows caught fragments of streetlight, casting colored shadows across stone floors that had been worn smooth by generations of worshippers. The silence was profound, almost alive, as if the very air was holding its breath. I set my backpack down beside the back pew and unzipped it slowly, the sound seeming to echo through the vast space despite my efforts at stealth. The gasoline containers felt heavier than they had during our planning sessions, their weight somehow more significant now that I was standing in the place I intended to destroy. The brother positioned himself near the entrance we had used, keeping watch for any signs of discovery, while I began the methodical process of dousing the wooden pews with accelerant. The first container opened with a sharp pop that made my heart race. The smell of gasoline immediately filled my nostrils, harsh and chemical, completely at odds with the gentle atmosphere of incense and old wood that had welcomed me into this sacred space. I began pouring the clear liquid along the back row of pews, watching it soak into wood that had probably been crafted by hand over a century ago. Each splash felt deliberate, purposeful, like I was writing a message in gasoline that would soon become a roaring declaration of anger and revenge. Moving methodically from pew to pew, I worked my way toward the front of the church, emptying container after container across surfaces where families had sat together for Sunday worship, where children had fidgeted through sermons, where elderly parishioners had found comfort during their final years of life. The gasoline pooled in carved decorations and soaked into cushions that bore the impressions of countless bodies seeking connection with their God. I tried to focus on my anger, on every injustice that had brought me to this moment, but something about the intimate scale of destruction I was creating felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The altar area required special attention according to our plan. This was the symbolic heart of Christian worship, the place where their communion rituals occurred, where their priests proclaimed the divinity of Jesus Christ. I emptied my largest container across the altar cloth, watching the gasoline darken the white fabric and pool around brass candlesticks that reflected my flashlight beam like golden eyes watching my every movement. The wooden crucifix above the altar seemed to loom larger as I approached it, and for reasons I couldn't understand, I found myself avoiding direct eye contact with the carved figure hanging there. Stepping back to survey my work, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and revulsion. The entire front section of the church now reeked of gasoline, and I could see the liquid glistening on every surface that would soon burst into flames. According to our calculations, the fire would spread rapidly through the dry wood construction, consuming decades of craftsmanship and centuries of accumulated faith in a matter of minutes. The symbolism would be unmistakable. Christian places of worship were not safe from the consequences of their community's actions against Muslims worldwide. I reached into my jacket pocket for the box of matches, my hands surprisingly steady despite the enormity of what I was about to accomplish. The brother gave me a thumbs up from his position near the door, confirming that our escape route remained clear and that the leader had not signaled any approaching danger. Everything was proceeding exactly according to our carefully rehearsed plan. All that remained was the single action that would transform months of planning into irreversible reality. The matchbox felt small and ordinary in my palm, completely inadequate for the magnitude of destruction it was about to unleash. I slid it open and selected a single wooden match, holding it up to examine the red phosphorus tip that would soon ignite my carefully prepared accelerant. This tiny stick represented the culmination of every grievance I had nursed, every moment of discrimination I had experienced, every news story about Muslim suffering that had fed my growing rage. I struck the match against the rough side of the box, and it flared to life with a sharp hiss that seemed unnaturally loud in the church's stillness. The small flame danced at the end of the wooden stick, casting flickering shadows across my face and illuminating the gasoline-soaked surfaces that surrounded me. In that tiny light, I could see my entire future burning. Once I lowered this flame to the accelerant-soaked wood, there would be no going back. I would become someone who had destroyed a place of worship, someone who had chosen violence over dialogue, someone who had allowed hatred to completely consume whatever goodness had once existed in my heart. The moment I began lowering that match toward the gasoline-soaked pew in front of me, my entire body froze completely. Not fear, not hesitation, not a last-minute change of heart. I literally could not move a single muscle. My arms stopped moving downward as if I had hit an invisible barrier. My fingers remained locked around the match, unable to release it or pull it back. My legs felt rooted to the stone floor, like I had suddenly become part of the church's foundation. Even my breathing seemed restricted, each breath requiring conscious effort rather than the automatic rhythm that had sustained me throughout my life. The flame continued burning at the end of the match, but instead of moving closer to the gasoline, it seemed frozen in space, exactly where my paralysis had begun. I tried desperately to force my arm to complete the motion, to overcome whatever was preventing me from finishing what I had started. But my body simply refused to obey my commands. Panic began rising in my throat as I realized that something beyond my understanding was happening, something that had nothing to do with second thoughts or moral qualms about my planned action. Then the wind started. At first, just a gentle stirring of air that I might have attributed to the building's ventilation system or changes in outside temperature. But within seconds, it had grown into a steady breeze that moved through the sanctuary with impossible force. Every door and window was closed and locked. We had checked them carefully during our entry to ensure no unexpected drafts would interfere with our fire. Yet, air was moving through that sacred space with increasing intensity, carrying the scent of gasoline toward the altar and rustling papers I couldn't see in the darkness. The flame on my match began dancing wildly in the moving air, bending and flickering in directions that seemed to defy the wind's pattern. Instead of being extinguished by the increasingly powerful breeze, the tiny fire burned brighter and more steadily, as if it was being protected by some invisible force. My eyes began watering from the strain of staring at that impossible flame, but I couldn't look away or even blink voluntarily. The temperature in the sanctuary began dropping rapidly, far beyond what could be explained by normal November weather or the building's heating system. My breath became visible in small puffs of vapor, and I could feel cold seeping through my jacket and into my bones. The gasoline I had poured began emitting visible fumes in the suddenly frigid air, creating an ethereal mist that rose from every surface I had prepared for destruction. My hands started shaking uncontrollably, not from nervousness or adrenaline, but from a bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from within my own body, rather than the surrounding environment. The match trembled in my paralyzed grip, its flame continuing to burn impossibly bright against the backdrop of my visible breath and the mysterious wind that shouldn't have existed in that sealed sanctuary. But the most overwhelming aspect of what was happening wasn't the physical impossibilities I was experiencing. Something else was present in that church with us, something that felt vast and ancient and completely aware of my thoughts and intentions. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear any voice or supernatural sound, but I knew with absolute certainty that someone was standing directly behind me. Not the brother who remained frozen by the door, not the leader who was positioned outside. Someone else entirely, someone whose presence filled the entire sanctuary with a weight that pressed against my chest and made breathing feel like a conscious effort rather than an automatic function. For the first time in my adult life, I realized that I wasn't in control of anything. Not my body, not the situation, not even my own thoughts, which seemed to be rearranging themselves in ways I couldn't predict or prevent. The match continued burning in my paralyzed hand, while invisible eyes watched every breath I took and every prayer I had never spoken aloud echoed through a consciousness that was no longer entirely my own. The presence behind me grew stronger with each passing second, pressing against my consciousness like a gentle but irresistible force that demanded acknowledgement. I tried desperately to turn around, to see who or what was causing this overwhelming sensation of being observed, but my neck muscles remained completely locked in place. My eyes could only stare straight ahead at the gasoline-soaked altar, at the wooden cross that seemed to glow faintly in the matchlight, at the impossible flame that continued burning steadily in my paralyzed hand despite the supernatural wind that filled the sanctuary. My legs began trembling first, a violent shaking that started in my knees and spread rapidly throughout my entire lower body. The tremors weren't from cold or fear, but from something much deeper, as if every cell in my body was responding to a frequency I couldn't consciously hear. The stone floor beneath my feet felt unstable, not because it was moving, but because my ability to maintain balance was being systematically stripped away by forces completely beyond my understanding or control. The match slipped from my trembling fingers and fell toward the gasoline-soaked pew in front of me. Time seemed to slow as I watched that tiny flame tumble through the frigid air, and I knew that the destruction I had planned was about to become reality, regardless of my sudden paralysis. But instead of igniting the accelerant and fulfilling months of careful preparation, the match landed safely on a dry section of wood several feet away from any gasoline, its flame flickering once before dying completely in a small wisp of smoke. My legs gave out completely at that moment, and I collapsed to my knees on the cold stone floor with an impact that sent sharp pain shooting through my kneecaps and up my spine. The sound of my body hitting the ground echoed through the sanctuary like a gunshot, and I heard the brother gasp audibly from his position near the entrance. But I couldn't call out to him or signal that I needed help. My voice had abandoned me as completely as my ability to control my physical movements. Kneeling there in the gasoline fumes and impossible wind, I felt tears beginning to stream down my cheeks without any conscious decision to cry. These weren't tears of frustration or anger or even fear, but something much more profound. Every emotion I had suppressed during months of planning, every doubt I had pushed aside, every moment of moral clarity I had deliberately ignored came flooding back with overwhelming intensity. The weight of what I had nearly accomplished, the magnitude of destruction I had been willing to cause crashed over me like a physical blow. I started sobbing like I hadn't done since I was 5 years old. Deep, wrenching sounds that seemed to come from somewhere far below my conscious mind. The tears fell onto the stone floor beneath me, mixing with drops of gasoline that had splashed during my preparation, creating small, dark puddles that reflected the streetlight filtering through the stained glass windows. Each sob felt like it was tearing something loose inside my chest, some carefully constructed barrier that had been holding back years of accumulated pain and confusion. The presence behind me shifted, and I felt what I can only describe as invisible hands resting gently on my shoulders. Not physical touch exactly, but a sensation of being held and comforted that was more real than any human contact I had ever experienced. The weight was warm despite the frigid air that continued moving through the sanctuary, and it carried with it a sense of unconditional acceptance that contradicted everything I thought I knew about divine judgment and religious condemnation. Words began forming in my mouth without any conscious intention to speak them. At first, they were just fragments, broken syllables that emerged between my desperate sobs. But gradually, they organized themselves into coherent sentences that seemed to come from some place deeper than my rational mind. I heard myself saying, "Jesus, if you're real, please help me," over and over again, each repetition becoming clearer and more heartfelt than the last. The irony of that prayer wasn't lost on me, even in my emotional breakdown. Here I was, a devout Muslim who had spent months planning to destroy a Christian church, calling out to Jesus Christ for assistance in the very sanctuary I had tried to burn down. Everything I had been taught about Islamic theology, about the nature of God, and the role of Jesus as merely a prophet rather than divine savior was being challenged by the undeniable reality of what I was experiencing in that sacred space. But the prayer felt completely natural, completely right, as if I had been preparing to speak those words my entire life without realizing it. Each time I repeated them, "Jesus, if you're real, please help me," I felt something shifting inside my chest, some fundamental orientation of my heart that was being gradually but permanently altered by forces I couldn't understand but somehow trusted completely. The brother had approached closer during my breakdown, and I could hear his urgent whispers, calling my name and asking what was wrong. But his voice seemed to come from very far away, filtered through layers of supernatural intervention that made normal human communication feel impossible. I wanted to explain what was happening, to warn him about the presence that filled the same sanctuary, to describe the wind and cold and overwhelming sense of being observed by divine eyes. But my mouth could only continue forming that single desperate prayer. The gasoline smell that had dominated the church's atmosphere began to fade, replaced by something that reminded me of my grandmother's garden after rain, fresh and clean and alive in ways that seemed impossible given the urban Manchester location and the November season. I realized that the supernatural wind was carrying away the chemical fumes I had introduced into this sacred space, cleansing the air of my destructive intentions and replacing them with fragrances that spoke of growth and renewal rather than death and destruction. My perception of time became completely distorted during those moments of breakdown. I might have been kneeling on that stone floor for minutes or hours, continuing to repeat my desperate prayer while tears streamed down my face and my body shook with emotions I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. The normal landmarks that usually helped me navigate reality had all disappeared, leaving me completely dependent on the invisible presence that continued to hold and comfort me despite my recent intentions toward this holy place. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself when you last felt completely broken and completely loved at the same time. Because that contradiction defined every second of what I was experiencing in that sanctuary. I was more aware than ever before of my capacity for hatred and destruction, of how close I had come to committing an act that would have harmed countless innocent people. Yet simultaneously, I felt embraced by a love that was bigger than my failures, more persistent than my anger, more real than any human relationship I had ever known. The wooden cross above the altar seemed to pulse with gentle light each time I repeated my prayer, not glowing visibly, but somehow becoming more present, more significant, more impossible to ignore. I found my eyes drawn to that simple symbol despite my lifelong training to view it as idolatrous. And instead of feeling religiously conflicted, I experienced a growing sense of recognition, as if I was finally seeing clearly something that had always been there, waiting for my attention. The supernatural wind began to subside gradually, and the temperature in the sanctuary started returning to normal levels. But the presence behind me remained constant, those invisible hands still resting on my shoulders, that sense of being completely known and completely accepted continuing to wash over me in waves that threatened to overwhelm what little rational thought I had left. I knew that whatever was happening to me in that sacred space was going to change everything about how I understood God, faith, and my own identity. I remained on my knees, tears still flowing, prayer still forming on my lips, while the brother stood helplessly nearby and the night continued around us completely. Unaware that everything I had believed about reality was being gently but permanently dismantled by love. I remained on my knees in that sanctuary for what felt like hours, though I had completely lost any sense of normal time. The brother had tried several times to get me to stand up and leave, whispering urgently about police patrols and the need to escape before we were discovered. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak beyond that repeated prayer, couldn't even acknowledge his presence in any meaningful way. Something had fundamentally changed inside me during those moments of divine encounter, and I knew instinctively that leaving that sacred space would require a different version of myself than the one who had entered with gasoline and hatred. The tears eventually stopped flowing, but the overwhelming sense of peace that replaced them was almost more disorienting than the emotional breakdown had been. I felt completely emptied out, as if every anger and resentment and carefully nurtured grievance had been literally pulled from my chest and dissolved in the supernatural atmosphere that still filled the church. What remained was a strange combination of exhaustion and clarity, of profound sadness for what I had almost done, and equally profound gratitude for whatever had stopped me. As the first hints of dawn began filtering through the stained glass windows, I heard the brother gathering our supplies and preparing to leave without me. His footsteps echoed through the sanctuary as he retrieved the empty gasoline containers and wiped down surfaces we had touched, eliminating evidence of our presence with the efficiency we had rehearsed during our planning sessions. But when he reached the door and called my name one final time, I still couldn't respond. The invisible hands remained on my shoulders, and I understood somehow that my vigil wasn't finished yet. The leader must have grown concerned when neither the brother nor I appeared at our predetermined meeting point, because I heard urgent text messages buzzing on the brother's phone for several minutes before the sound finally faded as he left me alone in the church. Part of me felt guilty about abandoning our carefully coordinated escape plan, but a much larger part felt relieved to be free from their expectations and demands. For the first time in months, I was making decisions based on my own spiritual instincts rather than group ideology or peer pressure. Dawn arrived gradually, painting the sanctuary in soft colors that seemed almost alive as they moved across stone walls and wooden surfaces. The gasoline smell had completely disappeared, replaced by that garden-fresh fragrance that defied logical explanation. I found myself able to move again, though slowly and carefully, as if my body was relearning how to function after being temporarily inhabited by something far greater than my individual consciousness. I heard the side door creak open around 6 a.m., followed by footsteps that were clearly different from the brothers' hurried exit. These steps were measured, purposeful, belonging to someone who belonged in this sacred space. A male voice called out a gentle hello, and I turned to see a middle-aged man in clerical collar approaching carefully, his expression showing concern rather than alarm, despite the obvious evidence that someone had been in his church overnight. The pastor, as he introduced himself, had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and graying hair that suggested years of experience dealing with unexpected situations. Instead of demanding explanations or threatening to call authorities, he simply asked if I was all right and whether I needed any assistance. His calm presence felt like a natural extension of whatever divine intervention had prevented me from completing my destructive mission. I told him everything. The words poured out of me with the same involuntary intensity as the tears had earlier, describing our months of planning, the gasoline I had poured throughout his sanctuary, the match I had tried to light, and the supernatural experience that had stopped me from burning down his church. I expected shock, anger, immediate demands that he call police to report my attempted arson. Instead, he listened with the patient attention of someone accustomed to hearing confessions and providing spiritual guidance. When I finished my account, including details about the impossible wind and mysterious presence and overwhelming sense of divine love, the pastor nodded thoughtfully and asked if I would like to sit with him in one of the pews while he shared some thoughts about what I had experienced. His matter-of-fact acceptance of my supernatural encounter amazed me almost as much as the encounter itself had. This wasn't a man who was struggling to believe my story, but someone who recognized familiar patterns in what I was describing. The pastor opened a well-worn Bible and read passages about Paul's conversion on the Damascus Road, explaining how God often chose the most unlikely people to demonstrate his power and grace. He talked about divine intervention in human affairs, about moments when heaven breaks through into earthly experience in ways that defy rational explanation, but leave undeniable evidence in changed hearts and transformed lives. Every word he spoke resonated with what I had just experienced, giving me vocabulary and theological framework for understanding the impossible night I had lived through. But the most remarkable moment came when the pastor looked directly into my eyes and said that God had clearly saved me from making a terrible mistake. Not because I deserved rescue, but because he had plans for my life that involved building rather than destroying, healing rather than harming, loving rather than hating. The certainty in his voice when he spoke about God's forgiveness and redemption felt like an echo of that invisible presence that had held my shoulders in the darkness. Right there, sitting in a pew that still showed damp spots where my gasoline had soaked into the wood, I made a decision that would define the rest of my existence. I told the pastor that I wanted to give my life to Jesus Christ, that I wanted to surrender everything I had believed about God and faith and my own identity to whatever power had intervened so dramatically in my destructive plans. The words felt foreign in my mouth, completely contrary to everything I had been taught about Islamic monotheism, yet also absolutely true and necessary. The pastor led me through what he called a sinner's prayer, helping me articulate my repentance for the hatred I had carried and my faith in Jesus as Lord and Saviour. Each phrase felt like another layer of my old identity being stripped away and replaced with something completely new. I wasn't just changing religions or switching theological allegiances, but undergoing a fundamental transformation of everything I understood about reality and my place within God's creation. Jesus, I don't understand what happened tonight, but I know you saved me from something terrible. I believe you died for my sins and rose again, and I want to follow you for the rest of my life. Please forgive me for the hatred I carried and the destruction I planned. Please make me into someone who builds your kingdom instead of tearing it down. The prayer felt like the most honest words I had ever spoken, completely authentic, despite being guided by someone I had met only an hour before. The moment I finished that prayer, something shifted in the atmosphere around us. The same presence I had felt during my breakdown returned, but gentler now, more welcoming, like a father embracing a prodigal son who had finally found his way home. The pastor smiled and told me that angels were celebrating in heaven over my decision, that my name had just been written in the book of life, that the same Jesus who had stopped me from burning down this church was now living in my heart as Lord and Saviour. Right there, in the church I had tried to destroy, I became a new creation. The old Azim, who had carried gasoline and matches and years of accumulated rage, died in that sanctuary, replaced by someone whose heart was filled with divine love instead of human hatred. Only Jesus could orchestrate something that impossibly redemptive, turning attempted destruction into supernatural salvation in the span of a single miraculous night. The weeks following my conversion were the most difficult period of my life, yet also the most transformative. When I returned home to Birmingham and told my parents that I had become a Christian, their reaction was everything I had feared and worse. My father, the respected Imam who had taught me to memorize the Quran, looked at me as if I had died before his eyes. My mother wept uncontrollably, asking where she had failed as a parent to raise a son who would abandon the faith of his ancestors for what she considered blasphemous idol worship. The conversation took place in our living room, the same space where we had held family prayers for years, where Quranic verses hung on the walls in beautiful Arabic calligraphy, where my childhood had been shaped by Islamic devotion and community belonging. Now, those familiar surroundings felt like accusations against my new faith, and I watched my parents struggle to reconcile their love for their son with their horror at his spiritual betrayal. My father demanded to know what had happened to me, what influences had corrupted my thinking, what enemies of Islam had manipulated me into this apostasy. When I tried to explain about the supernatural encounter in the church, about Jesus revealing himself to me in ways that defied explanation, he became angry in a way I had never seen before. He accused me of having a mental breakdown, of being brainwashed by Christian missionaries, of bringing shame on our family name and his position in the community. The ultimatum came 3 days later. Either I would renounce this Christian delusion and return to proper Islamic faith, or I would no longer be welcome in their home or considered part of their family. My younger siblings stood in the hallway listening to this conversation, their faces showing confusion and sadness as they watched our family being torn apart by my decision to follow Jesus. The pain of that moment was almost unbearable, but I knew that denying Christ after experiencing his reality so dramatically would be spiritual suicide. I moved out that week, taking only the few possessions I could carry in a single suitcase. My university dormitory became my temporary refuge while I tried to figure out how to rebuild my entire life from scratch. The friends I had made through Islamic student organizations stopped speaking to me completely when word spread about my conversion. The brother and the leader sent threatening messages, calling me a traitor who had betrayed everything we had worked for together. But even in the midst of losing my biological family, I was discovering a new kind of family at St. Michael's Church. The pastor who had led me to Christ introduced me to other congregation members, and their acceptance was immediate and unconditional. These were people who had every reason to fear and reject me, given what I had planned to do to their sacred space, yet they welcomed me with love that reflected the same divine grace I had experienced during my conversion. The baptism took place 6 weeks after that November night, in the same sanctuary where I had poured gasoline and planned destruction. Standing in the baptismal pool, looking out at faces that had become dear to me, I felt the weight of symbolism in what was happening. I was being buried with Christ in the same building I had tried to burn down, emerging from those waters as a completely new creation whose purpose was to build rather than destroy. The pastor baptized me in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And as I went under the water, I felt the last remnants of my old identity washing away. When I came up gasping and laughing, the congregation erupted in celebration, and I knew that I had found my true home among people who understood the transformative power of Jesus Christ in human hearts. My new purpose began taking shape during conversations with church leadership about how God might use my background and experience for His glory. The pastor connected me with organizations that worked in counter-radicalization, helping young Muslims who were following the same destructive path I had walked before my encounter with Christ. My testimony became a powerful tool for reaching people who were drowning in the same anger and hatred that had nearly consumed me. The work wasn't easy. Speaking to groups of at-risk youth, sharing my story in community centers and universities, facing the suspicion and sometimes hostility of both Muslim and Christian communities who questioned my motives and authenticity. But every time I saw recognition in a young person's eyes, every time someone chose dialogue over violence after hearing about my transformation, I felt the purpose that Jesus had saved me to fulfill. It was during one of these speaking engagements that I met Sarah, a former missionary who had returned from Central Asia to work with refugee communities in Manchester. She attended my presentation at an interfaith dialogue conference, and afterward approached me with questions about my experience that showed genuine spiritual insight rather than mere curiosity. Our conversation lasted 3 hours, and I knew before it ended that God had brought us together for reasons beyond professional collaboration. Sarah understood the cost of following Christ in ways that most Western Christians never experience. Her years of ministry in restricted countries had taught her about persecution and sacrifice, about maintaining faith when cultural pressures demanded compromise. She didn't romanticize my conversion or minimize the losses I had suffered, but she helped me see how God could use even those painful experiences for His purposes. Our wedding took place at St. Michael's Church 2 years after my conversion, surrounded by the same congregation that had embraced me when I had nowhere else to turn. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. We were celebrating new life and covenant relationship in the building I had once tried to destroy, demonstrating the redemptive power of Jesus Christ to transform enemies into family members. Our children, David and Grace, are now 4 and 2 years old, growing up in the same church where their father experienced supernatural intervention and divine grace. They know their daddy's testimony in age-appropriate terms, understanding that Jesus changed his heart from anger to love, from destruction to building, from hatred to forgiveness. Every Sunday, when we sit together in those wooden pews, some of which still bear faint stains from the gasoline I poured that November night, I'm reminded of the miraculous journey that brought us together. The counter-radicalization work continues to expand, taking me to schools and community centres across the UK and sometimes internationally. My story resonates particularly strongly with young men who feel marginalized and angry, who are searching for purpose and belonging in ways that can easily be exploited by extremist ideologies. When I describe the emptiness that violence promises to fill and the genuine fulfillment that only comes through relationship with Jesus Christ, I see the same hunger in their eyes that once drove me toward destruction. Every Sunday, I worship in that church, sitting in the same pews I tried to burn, surrounded by people I once wanted to terrorize, married to a woman I met through ministry that exists only because Jesus saved me from my worst impulses. The congregation knows my story, and they celebrate it regularly as a testimony to God's power to redeem any heart and transform any life. So I'm asking you, just as a brother would, what hatred is Jesus calling you to release today? What anger or resentment or desire for revenge is consuming your heart the way mine was consumed that November night? Because I'm here to tell you that no matter how far you've traveled down the path of destruction, no matter how much damage you've planned or even accomplished, Jesus Christ can meet you in your darkest moment and transform you into someone completely new. Jesus didn't just save that church from fire that night. He saved my soul from hell, my heart from hatred, my life from meaningless destruction. He gave me a family when my biological family rejected me, a purpose when my old identity crumbled, a future when my past should have disqualified me from any hope of redemption. That's the Jesus I serve, the Jesus I follow, the Jesus who can change your life just as dramatically as He changed mine if you let Him into your heart today.